19. Shaping the system, designing the conditions for coherence. Once leaders begin the inner work of emotional awareness and stability, the next challenge emerges, transforming their personal alignment into organizational architecture. This is the moment leadership moves from introspection to design, from understanding oneself to shaping the conditions under which others interpret, respond, and behave. The leader becomes a curator of emotional environments, a designer of meaning flows, a steward of coherence. In global organizations, this is far more complex than setting expectations or issuing guidance. Culture cannot be mandated. Alignment cannot be ordered. Tone cannot be standardized through policy. Organizations do not stabilize because leaders tell them to. They stabilize because leaders create the emotional conditions in which stability becomes the easiest and most natural response. One executive discovered this when she attempted to improve cross-regional alignment through a series of detailed memos. Each memo was clear, precise, and well-intentioned. Yet misinterpretations persisted. Behavior continued to diverge. She later realized that she had been trying to engineer alignment through information rather than through environment. "I assumed," she said, "that clarity was the solution. But clarity without emotional coherence simply doesn't stick." To shape the system, leaders must first understand that meaning does not travel through organizations mechanically, it travels emotionally. The conditions that shape emotion, trust, psychological safety, tone calibration, visible consistency, the handling of conflict and uncertainty, determine whether meaning remains intact or becomes distorted. One global manufacturing company demonstrated this vividly. After a period of drift, leadership introduced a seemingly simple shift: weekly cross-regional dialogue sessions, not to deliver updates, but to ask how messages were landing. They treated the organization as a living emotional system. They became curious about differences in interpretation. They examined how tone traveled. They explored the emotional logic behind delays, escalations, or silence. As leaders listened, the system began to self-correct. People felt seen. Tone stabilized. Assumptions were surfaced. Drift slowed. The organization realigned not because the message changed, but because the environment changed. Designing conditions for coherence requires the courage to step into these emotional conversations. Many leaders avoid them because they feel intangible, unpredictable, or uncomfortable. But in multicultural systems, these emotional conversations are the infrastructure. They are the equivalent of building roads before expecting cars to move smoothly across a country. Without emotional architecture, the organization has no reliable pathways for meaning to travel. Another global leader, overseeing operations in more than 20 countries, approached this work with unusual simplicity. He did not overhaul processes or implement complex frameworks. He focused instead on rhythm, consistent touchpoints, consistent tone, consistent language patterns, and consistent opportunities for teams to voice interpretation. Over time, this rhythm became a stabilizing force. Teams no longer treated leadership messages as isolated events but as part of a continuous emotional landscape. Rhythm became architecture. Consistency is not glamorous work, but it is structural work. It builds the emotional scaffolding that holds alignment in place. Shaping the system also means embracing transparency not as a buzzword, but as an emotional stabilizer. Transparency in global organizations does not mean sharing everything. It means reducing the emotional gaps in communication. When leaders omit context, teams fill the gaps with fear or assumption. When leaders explain the why behind decisions, the emotional temperature lowers. When leaders describe their expectations openly, ambiguity dissolves before it has the chance to expand. A global pharmaceutical company learned this during a high-stakes compliance upgrade. Initially, leadership communicated only what was necessary, believing conciseness would reduce overload. Instead, conciseness created ambiguity. Teams struggled to understand whether the shift signaled concern, pressure, or regulation-driven necessity. When leaders expanded the context, explaining the background, the strategic rationale, the intended emotional message, alignment returned almost overnight. Coherence was restored not through information, but through emotional transparency. Designing conditions for coherence also requires recognizing that systems amplify leadership behavior. A stable tone does not stay local, it becomes the model others emulate. A consistent urgency pattern becomes the organizational rhythm. A respectful handling of conflict becomes the cultural template. A calm response during crisis becomes the collective standard. Leaders underestimate how much people mirror the emotional cues of authority. Yet mirroring is not subconscious imitation, it is an adaptive behavior rooted in survival, belonging, and meaning-making. When leaders respond unpredictably, systems become volatile. When leaders respond predictably, systems become stable. One global services organization institutionalized this insight after years of observing emotional variability across its leadership ranks. They introduced what they called shared emotional principles, not as rules, but as cultural commitments. Leaders across the organization agreed on a set of emotional behaviors they would model: steady tone, explicit context, reflective listening, and articulation of intent. These were not instructions for employees, they were practices for leaders. Within 2 years, employees described the leadership climate as more unified and emotionally consistent. The system had been shaped by a shared emotional code. Shaping the system also involves designing mechanisms for early detection of drift. Leaders who understand emotional architecture know that drift never begins in strategy, it begins in feeling. They pay attention to hesitation. They notice changes in communication rhythm. They observe variations in how confidence is expressed across regions. They treat these early signals as data, emotional indicators that something has shifted in the system. A global energy company built a simple but powerful mechanism: quarterly emotional reviews alongside operational reviews. These sessions were not therapeutic, they were strategic. Leaders examined how teams were interpreting messages, where silence was increasing, where urgency felt uneven, and where trust appeared fragile. Emotional intelligence became part of operational governance. It was not optional. It was structural. By creating these feedback loops, they prevented drift before it became visible. Emotional misalignment was corrected near its origin, long before it could affect customers, regulators, or stakeholders. Ultimately, shaping the system means recognizing that emotional alignment is not the outcome of leadership, it is the environment leadership creates. It is not the message itself that stabilizes the organization, but the conditions in which the message lives. In global organizations, leaders do not control behavior. They control the conditions under which behavior emerges. They cannot force coherence. They can only design for it. And when they do, when the emotional climate is stable, when tone is predictable, when trust is deep, when interpretation is shared, something extraordinary happens. The organization becomes capable of moving with unity across borders, cultures, and crises. It becomes a global organism rather than a collection of loosely connected entities. It becomes aligned not because it has been instructed to be aligned, but because it is emotionally designed to be. The next chapter explores how this emotional architecture influences performance, how coherence translates into speed, quality, risk reduction, and long-term global resilience.